I'm Apollo 29 male. I live alone in a cramped one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat in Ridgefield, Colorado. It's not much, but it's mine and it's quiet. I work as the lead mechanic at Charlie's Auto Repair, a small shop on the edge of town where the smell of motor oil and gasoline is the only thing that's consistent in my life. For most of my life, I've been the family's dirty little secret. When my stepfather's will was read, I thought I'd finally been handed the ultimate insult. Instead, I was given a key, and that key led me to a truth so dark it threatened to burn my entire world to the ground. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My name is Apollo Bennett. The last name is my mother's, a name I've always carried with a mix of pride and defiance. I'm the illegitimate son, the product of her first marriage, which ended before I was old enough to form memories of my biological father. He was just a ghost, a story she rarely told. Because of that, I grew up feeling like a spare part in a machine that never quite ran right. When I was 5, my mother, Avery, married Pedro Morales. I had hopes, the kind of naive dreams a kid has about finally having a real family, but those hopes didn't last long. Pedro, now 61, was a man carved from stone. He was a traditional patriarch of Latin American descent with a booming voice and an unshakable belief in the sanctity of his own bloodline. I, Apollo Bennett, was not part of that bloodline. Our family lived in a beautiful 2-story house in the suburbs. It had the white picket fence, the manicured lawn, the whole American dream package. In the garage, Pedro kept the fleet of trucks for his company, Morales Logistics. It was a small but successful transportation business his own father had built. To Pedro, that company wasn't just a job, it was his legacy, a testament to the Morales name. He talked about it constantly, his eyes lighting up with a fire that was reserved only for the business and for his true son, Hugo. Hugo is my half-brother, 4 years younger than me. He was the golden child, the one who carried the Morales name and all of Pedro's expectations. Pedro spoiled him, blinded by pride, and as a result, Hugo grew up confident and ambitious but utterly naive about how the world actually worked. He worked at Morales Logistics, of course, handed a management title he hadn't earned. Hugo wasn't malicious, not really. He was just weak, molded by our stepfather's prejudices. He adopted Pedro's condescending attitude toward me, the outsider. I once overheard him at a party, laughing with his friends and referring to me as his unofficial brother. I just turned and walked away, feeling that familiar, dull ache in my chest. I learned early on to make myself small, to expect nothing. Pedro made his feelings clear. I was a freeloader, a burden he'd been forced to take on. My mother, now 58, was caught in the middle. She's a kind, gentle woman, but years of living with Pedro's dominant personality had worn her down. She used to be a fighter, raising me on her own for those first few years. Now her strength was channeled into just keeping the peace. She loved us both, I know she did, but she chose silence as a survival tactic. She was the fragile bridge between me and Pedro, and I knew that bridge could snap at any moment, so I learned to be quiet. I learned to stop asking for things. I learned to not hurt my mother by provoking her husband. As soon as I turned 18, I moved out. I found my place at Charlie's garage, working with my hands, fixing things that were broken. It was honest work and it kept my mind busy. I still visited my mother every weekend. She'd hug me tightly at the door, her eyes always tinged with a deep, unspoken sadness. Pedro would just give me a curt nod from his armchair, his presence a heavy weight in the room. I lived my life, paid my bills, and held on to my dignity. I told myself I didn't need Pedro's approval. But the truth is, growing up without a father's acceptance leaves a hole in you. It's not a gaping wound, it's a slow, smoldering burn that never quite goes out. In the last few months, something had changed. Pedro, normally so boisterous and controlling, had become quiet. My mother mentioned he'd been complaining of chest pains and exhaustion. He stopped hosting his loud weekend barbecues. One Sunday when I dropped by, I saw him just sitting on the front porch, staring into space. The sharp, authoritative glint in his eyes was gone, replaced by a clouded look of anxiety. I knew he'd been to the hospital, but he refused to talk about it. He was a man who equated weakness with failure. Admitting he was sick was, for him, like surrendering. But one afternoon, while waiting for my mother, I saw a medical report left on his desk. I only caught a few words, but they were enough. Chronic coronary artery disease, myocardial ischemia, high risk of heart attack. A cold stone dropped in my stomach. As much as I disliked the man, he was my mother's husband. If he collapsed, what would happen to her? What would happen to the company with Hugo in charge? The health scare seemed to ignite a new obsession in Pedro, his legacy. Every conversation was about Morales Logistics, about the bloodline, about the future. He would talk endlessly about Hugo, the heir, the pride of the Morales name. He never looked at me during these speeches. I was invisible, just Apollo Bennett, not Apollo Morales. It was the same old story, the same old wound, but it stung every single time. I had taught myself not to care, but it seemed my heart hadn't fully gotten the message. I was used to being the outsider, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. The silence was about to be broken, and the entire foundation of our family was about to crack wide open. One Tuesday evening, I got a text from my mother. "Family dinner tonight, please come, it's important." I hated these dinners. The forced politeness, the tension you could cut with a knife, listening to Pedro boast about the company while Hugo nodded along like a bobblehead. I always felt like a stranger at the table, eating quickly so I could escape. But my mother had asked, and I could hear the anxiety in her text, so I went. When I arrived at the two-story house, the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. My mother greeted me with a hug that was tighter than usual, her smile strained. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was trying to hold the family together with sheer force of will. We gathered at the dining table. Pedro sat at the head as always. He looked thinner, more gaunt than I'd ever seen him, but he still wore that cloak of authority. Hugo was on his right, babbling about some new contract he'd supposedly landed. I sat across from my mother, focusing on my plate, trying to build a wall around myself. The meal was suffocatingly quiet, the only sounds the clinking of silverware and Hugo's occasional nervous chatter. Then Pedro set his fork down. The sound was loud in the silence. He cleared his throat. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice low and gravelly. "My time might be short." My head snapped up. My mother froze, her face draining of all color. Hugo just stared, his eyes wide with a confusion that looked almost childish. "It's not serious," Pedro said, waving a hand dismissively, though his expression betrayed the lie. "But I need to get my affairs in order. I need to talk about my legacy." His voice grew stronger then, firmer, as if he were reading from a script he'd practiced 100 times. "My entire estate, my shares in Morales Logistics, my investments, the properties, it will all go to Hugo. He will take over the company and carry on the family name." He looked at Hugo, his eyes filled with a heavy, proud expectation. Hugo looked simultaneously terrified and thrilled. "Avery," Pedro continued, turning to my mother, "you will have your savings account, and of course you will always have this house." Then he turned to me. For the first time all night, his eyes met mine. The gaze was cold, empty, and final. "Apollo," he paused, "I have an old pickup truck in the garage. It was my father's. It's been with me for 40 years. I am leaving it to you." The air left my lungs. The room went absolutely still. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, each tick a hammer blow. My mother was staring at her plate, her knuckles white as she gripped her fork. I could see her jaw clenching, her lips pressed so tightly together she was daring herself to speak and failing. Hugo looked down, shuffling his feet, a flush of embarrassment on his face. He knew it was wrong, but he would never have the courage to say it. And me, I just sat there. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. On the inside, a storm was breaking, an old pickup truck, a piece of scrap metal. That was what I was worth to him. It was the final definitive statement. I was not and had never been family. I wasn't even angry. I was just empty. All the years of being pushed aside, of being ignored, of being treated like a ghost in his house had culminated in this one pathetic gesture. My mind flashed back through a lifetime of rejections. I was 7, drawing him a birthday card, carefully writing "Dad" on the front. He glanced at it, set it on the table, and said, "Don't call me that." I was 12, trying to help him fix an engine, and he'd swatted my hand away, scolding me for touching things that aren't yours. I was 18, asking to work at the company just to sweep the floors to prove I was worth something. He'd refused flatly. "This company is for the Morales bloodline." Every time guests came over, he would introduce Hugo as my son and me as my wife's son, my Mo. Her would squeeze my hand under the table, but her silent comfort was never enough to patch the holes he punched in me. Now it was done, a rusty truck in a garage. I nodded slowly. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, put my napkin on the table, and said, "Thank you, Mom, dinner was great." I walked to the door. "Apollo, wait," my mother started, her voice cracking. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at her, I knew I would break, and I refused to give Pedro the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. I walked out of that house and got into my own beat-up car. I drove through the quiet streets, the streetlights blurring past me. I didn't go home. I drove to the shop Charlie's. I let myself in, sat on a stool under the harsh fluorescent lights, and just stared at the half-assembled engine on the lift. I wasn't angry about the money or the company. I was grieving. Grieving the fact that after all these years, after all my trying, I was still and always would be the outsider. He had made it official. I was nothing to him. In the weeks after that dinner, I tried to fall back into my routine. Wake up, coffee, ride my bike to the shop, lose myself in the guts of an engine, ride home, sleep, but the familiar rhythm felt off. The roar of the engines and the smell of grease couldn't drown out the image of my mother's face at that table, pale, silent, and defeated. I worried about her. Her silence had always been a shield, but now I feared it was becoming a cage. Pedro, meanwhile, started acting even stranger. His obsession with the legacy was replaced by a new, nervous secrecy. On the weekends, he'd leave the house at dawn, long before my mother was even awake, and wouldn't return until well after dark. And he was driving the old pickup truck, the one he'd so generously left to me. I'd assumed it was just a rusting hulk in the garage, but apparently he was using it regularly. What was truly odd was his behavior around it. My mother mentioned he now kept the garage door locked at all times, even when he was home. He wouldn't let anyone near the truck. This was new. Pedro was arrogant, not paranoid. There was a tension in him, a frantic energy I hadn't seen before. It was as if he was hiding something, and that premonition made my skin crawl. One Saturday morning, I stopped by to check on my mother. Pedro was in the driveway, looking agitated. He called me over, his eyes avoiding mine. "Apollo," he said, his voice clipped and hurried. "The truck, it's making a noise, a rattle in the engine. Can you fix it?" I was stunned. He had never in my entire life asked for my help with anything related to his legacy. But I knew my mother was watching from the kitchen window and I didn't want to cause a scene. "Sure," I said, grabbing my small toolbox from my car. I unlocked the garage and popped the hood. It was an old machine but well kept. I started inspecting the engine, checking the belts, looking for anything loose. To check the electrical, I slid into the driver's seat. The cab smelled like old vinyl and something else, a faint, coppery, metallic scent I couldn't place. I turned the key to accessory and the dashboard lit up. The truck was so old it didn't have a modern infotainment system, but Pedro had installed a small, aftermarket GPS unit on the dash. It flickered to life and the recent history was displayed on the screen. My breath caught. It was a list of the same coordinates over and over. A single location logged dozens of times. It wasn't Morale's Logistics. It wasn't any supplier or client I'd ever heard of. The location was deep in Deer Valley, a remote, forested area in the mountains mostly used by hunters, a desolate place with very few people. I frowned, a cold unease spreading through my chest. Why would Pedro be driving to the middle of nowhere multiple times a week? I heard him pacing outside the garage. Keeping my movements casual, I pulled out my phone, angled it at the screen, and quickly snapped a photo of the coordinates. I kept my face blank, shut the truck off, and got back to the engine. I found a loose bolt on the heat shield, an easy fix. I tightened it, closed the hood, and wiped my hands on a rag. "It's done," I told him, "just a loose shield." Pedro just grunted, not even a thank you. He immediately pulled the garage door down and locked it, his eyes darting around as if he was afraid someone had been watching. I said goodbye to my mother, my mind racing. All day, those coordinates burned a hole in my pocket. What was he doing out there? Was it some kind of shady business deal, hiding assets? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. The secrecy, the paranoia, the remote location. I thought of my mother's anxious eyes every time Pedro left the house. I remembered the tense way he'd been cleaning the truck's bed liner just last week. The smell of bleach mixing with the metallic scent I'd noticed in the cab. My suspicion grew from a smell. Spark into a smoldering fire. I couldn't let it go. I wasn't just curious anymore. I was worried. I had to know what he was hiding, for my mother's sake. I had to find out what was at the end of that GPS trail. I decided to wait. I'd wait for a day when I knew Pedro was occupied. My mother had mentioned he had an all-day series of logistics meetings the following Tuesday. That would be my chance. I would follow those coordinates and see the truth for myself. The image of that isolated cabin haunted me for days. I'd have nightmares about it. Sometimes I'd dream it was filled with treasure, some secret fortune my stepfather was hoarding. But most nights the dreams were darker. I'd see my mother trapped inside, pounding on the door, and I couldn't get to her. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering. I knew I couldn't live with the suspicion. I had to go back. I waited until the next Tuesday, the day my mother had confirmed Pedro would be in back-to-back meetings at the company office. I got up before dawn and gathered a few tools from the shop, a heavy-duty bolt cutter, a small pry bar, and my lockpick set. I hoped I wouldn't need them, but my gut told me I would. I drove my own truck back up the mountain, the winding road disappearing into the dense, foggy pine forest. When I arrived, the cabin was just as I'd left it, silent, cold, and forbidding. There was no smoke from the chimney, and the front door was secured with the same thick padlock. I parked my truck out of sight and approached the cabin, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. Standing at the door, I took a deep breath, pulled out the lockpick set, and went to work. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. Whatever was in here, I was going to find out. The old lock was stubborn, but after a few minutes it clicked open. I pulled the shackle free and slowly pushed the door. It swung open with a dry, groaning creak that echoed in the forest silence. A wave of cold, musty air hit me, thick with the smell of damp wood and that same sharp, metallic scent I'd noticed in the truck. Only this time it was stronger. It smelled like old blood. I froze, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air ran straight down my spine. I pulled the high-powered flashlight from my bag and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow, wood-paneled hallway. The place was disturbingly tidy. A small gas stove in the corner had soot on it as if it had been used recently. There were blankets folded neatly on a chair, and a shelf was stocked with canned food and bottles of water, all arranged in precise rows. This was not an abandoned shack. Someone was using this place as a long-term hideout. I moved down the hall, my boots silent on the dusty floorboards. I stopped at the first door, the one I'd seen Pedro go into before. This door was different. It was secured with a massive, industrial-grade padlock, the kind you'd see on a storage container. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't for keeping people out. This was for keeping something in. I grabbed the bolt cutters from my bag. My hands were trembling so badly it took me 2 tries to get a grip on the shackle. I squeezed with all my strength. The metal groaned and then snapped with a loud crack that sounded like a gunshot in the tiny cabin. The lock fell to the floor. I pulled the door open, but my flashlight beam didn't hit a wall. It hit metal. Behind the wooden door was a second door, a thick iron-barred gate like a prison cell. My heart stopped. And then I saw movement. A shape huddled in the back corner. I stepped closer and a face emerged from the shadows, illuminated by my flashlight. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her hair was matted, her face gaunt, and her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it stole my breath. Her clothes were clean but old, as if she'd been wearing them for months. The room was tiny, holding only a small cot, a thin blanket, and a few water bottles. When she saw me, she scrambled to the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking and raw, "please help me." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Who are you?" I stammered. "Who did this?" "Stay calm," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll come back, I promise." My mind was screaming, but I forced myself to move. I went to the next door in the hallway. It was identical, wooden door, heavy padlock. I cut the lock, pulled it open, and found the same thing, an iron-barred gate. Inside, another girl, this one in her early 20s, was curled up on a cot. She looked up, her eyes just as haunted, just as terrified. There was one more door, the same setup, the same result. A third girl, maybe 25, looked at me with dead eyes as if she'd given up hope long ago. 3 girls, 3 makeshift prison cells. This wasn't a hideout. It was a dungeon. I stumbled back to the porch, my legs giving out. I collapsed against the railing, gasping for air, but my lungs wouldn't work. It felt like the forest was spinning. The metallic smell, the locked rooms, the terrified faces, it all coalesced into a single, monstrous, undeniable truth. Pedro, the man I called my stepfather, the man my mother loved, what had he done? I wanted to be wrong. I wanted this to be a terrible mistake, but their desperate eyes and their trembling pleas were real. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking so violently I could barely unlock it. I dialed Pedro's number. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to hear his voice, to hear him deny it. It rang 3 times, then he picked up. "Apollo, what is it?" His voice was calm but tinged with the stress of his meetings. I took a ragged breath. "I'm at the cabin," I said, my voice flat. "The one in Deer Valley, I'm inside." There was a dead silence on the line. I could hear his breathing, suddenly shallow and fast. What cabin?" he stammered. "You're mistaken, there's nothing there, go home, Apollo." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice cracking with a rage I didn't know I possessed. 3 girls, Pedro, locked in rooms, I saw them, they're begging for help. Another pause, this one longer, heavier. Then his voice came back, stripped of all pretense. It was low, urgent, and terrified. "Apollo, listen to me, do not do anything, don't go anywhere, stay right there, I'm coming, I'm on my way, I can explain, you don't understand." "Explain what?" I yelled into the phone. "What are you hiding, Pedro? Don't be stupid," he hissed, his voice a mix of a plea and a command. "I'm begging you, stay there, I'm coming." The line went dead. I stood there, the silence of the forest rushing back in, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Explain, the word was a joke. No explanation could ever justify this. I had just opened a door to a nightmare, and I knew in that moment I could never, ever close it again. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get in my truck and drive until the tires melted. But I couldn't leave them. Waiting for Pedro's explanation was a repulsive, absurd idea. What could he possibly say? I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force the trembling from my hands, and went back inside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the grim hallway. I went back to the first cell, to the youngest girl. The heavy iron door was an immovable object. I had the bolt cutters, but the lock was a hardened steel discus lock, shielded and impossible to cut. The hinges were welded to a steel frame. This was built to last. I pressed my face close to the bars, my light aimed at the floor so I wouldn't blind her. "Don't be afraid," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'm going to get you out, I promise, but I need you to tell me what happened, who did this." She clung to the bars, her nails making a scraping sound on the metal that set my teeth on edge. Her voice was a broken whisper. I was promised a job in Denver, a cleaning job at a hotel. She was sobbing, fighting for every word. He, an older man, he picked me up. He said he was taking me to the staff housing, then he brought me here and he locked me in. Her story came out in painful fragments. There were 3 of them, all lured by similar false promises. They didn't know where they were. The older man came a few times a week, always in an old pickup truck. He brought food and water. The doors only ever opened when he was here. Then her voice dropped so low I could barely hear it. He makes us do things. She didn't have to say what. The shame and horror in her voice told me everything. The oldest one, in the back room, she tried to fight him once. He beat her. He didn't feed her for 3 days. After that, we were all too scared. My blood ran cold. The older man, the pickup truck, the secret cabin, it was him, it was Pedro. The full monstrous weight of it crushed me. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean against the wall. This wasn't just kidnapping, this was a horror show. I thought of my mother, her gentle smile. The way she tried to hold our broken family together. This truth would not just break her, it would shatter her into a million pieces. The man she had loved, lived with, and trusted for over 20 years, was this, a monster. But then I looked at the girl's face, streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes begging me for salvation. And the other 2 locked in the dark. I was standing at a crossroads. I could stay silent. I could pretend I never saw this, walk away and protect my mother from the truth, or I could destroy my family to save these women. Pity for my mother warred with a white-hot rage I'd never felt before. Rage at Pedro for his cruelty, his deceit, and for putting me in this impossible position. But it wasn't a choice. Not really. To walk away would make me an accomplice. It would make me a coward. And I would not be him. I would not be the man who chose silence. I backed out of the cabin, my mind made up. This was going to destroy us, but I had to do it. I had to be the one to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. My hands were shaking again, but this time with adrenaline. I pulled out my phone. I had to do this right. Pedro was on his way. He was panicked, and that made him dangerous. I dialed 911. My voice sounded strange, detached, as if it belonged to someone else. "I need to report an active kidnapping. I'm at a remote cabin in the Deer Valley forest." I gave them the coordinates from Pedro's GPS. "There are 3 women. They're locked in cells inside the cabin. They're alive, but they're terrified. The man who did this, he's on his way here right now. His name is Pedro Morales. You need to send a tactical team. Immediately." The operator was professional, her voice calm as she took the information. She asked me to stay on the line to get to a safe distance. I hung up. I couldn't leave. I went back to the hallway, my flashlight beam finding each of the girls' faces. "The police are coming," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I've called them. They're on their way right now. You're going to be safe, I promise." I saw a flicker of hope in their eyes, but it was buried under years of fear. They didn't dare to believe it yet. I stepped back onto the porch, my heart feeling like it was going to explode from my chest. I stood in the cold, thin mountain air, staring at the cabin and waited. The wind whistled through the pines, a low, mournful sound. It sounded like the world was ending, and for my family it was. It felt like an eternity, but it was less than 20 minutes. I heard it before I saw it, the frantic rumble of an engine, tires spitting gravel. Headlights slashed through the fog, sweeping across the trees like searchlights. The old pickup truck skidded to a stop in front of the cabin, the engine cutting out abruptly. Pedro practically fell out of the driver's side. His face was ghostly pale, his suit jacket rumpled and stained with sweat. The authoritative mask was gone, replaced by the raw, wide-eyed panic of a cornered animal. His gaze immediately locked onto the open front door, the broken padlock on the ground. I saw his shoulders slump, the last bit of denial evaporating. He knew it was over. I was standing on the porch, my arms crossed, my whole body vibrating. Our eyes met across the small clearing. In his, I saw a terrifying vortex of fear, white-hot anger, and a desperate, pathetic plea. He moved toward me, his steps slow and heavy. "Apollo," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He was trying to sound calm, but it was trembling. "It's not what you think. Listen to me, just listen. We can fix this." "Fix it?" The word came out as a bitter laugh. The rage I'd been suppressing my entire life finally boiled over. "Fix what, Pedro?" My voice was rising, echoing in the dead quiet forest. "Those girls in there, did you fix them? Why did you lock them up? Why were they begging me for their lives?" He flinched, his face contorting. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice gaining volume, cracking with desperation. "You're destroying this family, Apollo. Do you have any idea what this will do to your mother, to Hugo? You're ruining everything." He lunged forward, grabbing the front of my shirt. I could smell the sour scent of his panic. Family? I spat the word back at him. What family? The one you never, ever let me be a part of. I shoved him back and he stumbled. I called the police, Pedro. They're on their way. It's over. His eyes widened, the fear turning instantly to pure animalistic rage. The police? He roared. Before I could react, he lunged again, not at me but at my phone, which I was still holding. He slapped it from my hand and it clattered across the wooden porch, the screen shattering. You don't understand anything, he screamed, his face purple, veins bulging on his neck. Then it was chaos. He shoved me hard and I fell backward, crashing into the cabin wall. A wooden chair splintered under my weight. I tried to scramble up, but he was on me. He was stronger than I'd imagined, fueled by sheer terror. His hands clamped around my throat, squeezing. His eyes were wild, blazing with a terrifying light. You're ruining me, he bellowed, his voice breaking. You're ruining everything. I couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in my vision. My lungs were on fire. I clawed at his arms, thick and unmoving. Instinct took over. I wasn't the 12-year-old boy he could swat away anymore. I swung my arm, my fist connecting with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough. I twisted, bucked, and threw him off me. He staggered back, slamming into the edge of a small table. He gasped for air, blood trickling from his nose, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. I was on my feet, breath and heavily, my hands shaking uncontrollably. We stared at each other for a second, the silence filled only by our ragged breaths, and then we heard it. The high, piercing wail of sirens cutting through the night. They were close. Flashes of red and blue light pulsed through the trees, getting brighter. Pedro froze, his face just crumbled, the rage, the strength, the authority, it all vanished, leaving behind a hollow, defeated old man. The sirens grew louder, joined by the roar of engines and the sound of car doors slamming. Police, hands up, don't move. Figures in dark uniforms burst from the trees, guns drawn. I immediately put my hands in the air, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break a rib. Pedro just stood there, his arms limp. You're wrong, he muttered, his voice weak. I didn't. Two officers grabbed him, slammed him against the side of the truck, and cuffed his hands behind his back. You have the right to remain silent. The words of the Miranda warning sounded surreal. A breaching team rushed past me into the cabin. I heard the loud clang of metal on metal as they broke open the locks. Moments later, the girls were led out one by one. They were wrapped in blankets, blinking in the flashing lights, sobbing with a mixture of terror and relief. They clung to each other, their eyes finding me in the chaos. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my chest tight with a pain so deep I couldn't name it. Pedro was slumped against the truck, his head bowed. The police lights illuminated his face, the blood, the sweat, the empty, vacant stare. The powerful patriarch, the man who controlled my entire childhood, was gone. In his place was just a common criminal. We were all taken to the station. I spent the rest of the night in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room, giving my statement while the girls were tended to by paramedics and counselors. When I finally signed the last page, the first gray light of dawn was breaking over Ridgefield. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, and numb, but my night wasn't over. My mother still didn't know, and I had to be the one to tell her. I drove through the silent, misty streets, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. My face stung from the scratches where Pedro had clawed at me, and my shirt was torn and smeared with dirt. I pulled up to the two-story house and the kitchen light was already on. A faint, warm glow in the pre-dawn darkness. My mother opened the door before I even knocked. She must have been watching from the window. Her face was pale, her eyes red from a sleepless night. When she saw me, my disheveled state, the cuts, the look on my face, she froze, her hand flying to her mouth. Apollo, my God, what happened to you? Are you okay? I couldn't meet her eyes. I'm okay, Mom, I mumbled, my voice thick. I need to sit down. I walked past her and collapsed onto the living room sofa. She brought me a glass of water, her hands trembling. She sat in the chair opposite me, her eyes pleading for an answer she was terrified to hear. Apollo, you're scaring me, what is it? I took a deep, ragged breath. Mom, I went to a place, a cabin in the woods in Deer Valley, her brow furrowed in confusion. I followed Pedro there. I saw her flinch at his name. There were 3 girls, Mom, locked in rooms with iron bars. Her face went blank with disbelief. What are you talking about? He was holding them there, I said, the words feeling like acid on my tongue. He imprisoned them, he hurt them, Mom. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, Apollo, that's impossible, it must be a mistake. It's not, I said, my voice breaking. I told her everything. The GPS coordinates, the locked doors, the girls' stories, the confrontation, the sirens. The police arrested him, Mom, he's in jail. No. The glass of water slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, the sound ripping through the quiet room. She didn't faint. She just crumpled, folding in on herself, and a sound came out of her, a deep, guttural wail of a pain so profound I had never heard anything like it. She collapsed into a heap on the floor, and I rushed to her, holding her as she sobbed, her body shaking violently. I stayed with her all morning, sitting in the silence of that broken home. When she finally woke from an exhausted sleep, she just stared at the ceiling, tears rolling silently down her temples. The storm hit that afternoon. The local news broke the story: prominent businessman Pedro Morales arrested for kidnapping. The media descended on our house like vultures. Cameras, microphones, reporters shouting questions. The news spread through Ridgefield like a virus. Social media exploded. They called Pedro a monster. They called us a sick family. Hugo, who had idolized his father, completely shattered. He tried to post a denial on social media. "It's a misunderstanding, my fa. There is a good man," but his words were weak and the public tore him to shreds. He quickly realized the truth. The father he worshipped was a criminal. Morale's logistics imploded. Contracts were canceled, accounts were frozen, employees quit, Hugo's friends vanished. The pride, the legacy, the name Pedro had built his entire life around, it all turned to ash in less than 48 hours. Hugo had a complete breakdown and locked himself in his room, refusing to see or speak to anyone. 3 days later, the other shoe dropped. The police, searching the area around the cabin, brought in K9 units and ground-penetrating radar. About 30 meters from the cabin, they found a disturbance in the soil. They started digging. They uncovered skeletal remains. Decomposed but identifiable by a few scraps of clothing and a gold watch engraved with the initials RM. DNA tests confirmed it. The remains belonged to Raul Morales, Pedro's father, who had been missing for nearly a decade. The news hit me like a physical blow. Pedro hadn't just been a kidnapper, he was a murderer. The media reported that he confessed during interrogation. It was about the inheritance. Raul had planned to donate the company and his fortune to a children's cancer charity. Pedro, obsessed with the Morales bloodline, couldn't let that happen. He'd killed his own father, buried him in the woods, and built his dungeon right next to his father's grave. My mother, hearing this, simply shut down. She sank into a deep, silent shock. Hugo was hospitalized for severe depression. The trial was a formality. Pedro, gaunt and broken, pled guilty to everything. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Morales' logistics was seized and liquidated. The bank foreclosed on the house. Hugo left the hospital, left a short note for my mother: "I have to go, don't look for me," and disappeared. Months later, a postcard came from Seattle. It just said, "I'm okay." My mother and I were left with nothing but a small savings account in her name and my old car. We couldn't stay in Ridgefield, where every face was a reminder. We sold what little we had left and moved to a small, quiet town near Denver. It's been a year. We live in a small, rented 2-bedroom house. It's modest, but it's peaceful. My mother has started gardening. I see her on the porch tending to her flowers, and sometimes I hear her humming. It's a sound I haven't heard since I was a child. I work at a local auto shop. They just know me as Apollo, the quiet guy who's good with engines. No one here knows my past. The wounds are still there, they'll always be there, but they're scars now, not open wounds. I learned that truth is a brutal thing. It freed 3 innocent women, but it decimated my family. I often wonder if I could have done it differently, but the answer is always no. Silence is complicity. I still carry the Bennett name, the name that made me an outsider. But it was I, the unofficial brother, who brought the truth to light. I learned that blood means nothing. Your actions, your choices, that's what defines you. I chose to stand up even when it cost me everything. A neighbor asked me the other day what the hardest lesson I ever learned was. I thought for a moment. That sometimes, I said, you have to lose everything you thought you wanted just to find out what you truly need. I found my peace. It's not loud and it's not glamorous. It's just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when I was tested, I didn't become the monster I'd lived with my whole life. I chose my own path, and for the first time, I'm not looking back.